Hello students. I am going to speak to you today about A K Ramanujan, one of our illustrious Indian English poets, and in particular of one poem which is much anthologized and which is justly well recognized as one of his finest achievements. The poem is called A River. I think in all matters of poetry, we should perhaps first listen to the poem before we do anything else. So I am going to begin by reading the poem and then we'll move on to other matters. So the poem is called A River, and this is how it goes. In Madurai, the city of temples and poets who sang of cities and temples, every summer a river dries to a trickle in the sand, bearing the sand ribs, straw and women's hair, clogging the water gates, at the rusty bars under the bridges with patches of repair all over them, the wet stones glistening like sleepy crocodiles, the dry ones shaven water buffaloes lounging in the sun. The poets only sang of the floods. The new poets still quoted the old poets. No one spoke in verse of the pregnant woman, drowned, with perhaps twins in her kicking at blank walls even before birth. He was there for a day when they had the floods. People everywhere talked of the inches rising, of the precise number of cobbled steps run over by the water, rising on the bathing places, and the way it carried off 3 village houses, 1 pregnant woman, and a couple of cows named Gopi and Brinda as usual. He said, "The river has water enough to be poetic about only once a year, and then it carries away in the first half hour 3 village houses, a couple of cows named Gopi and Brinda, and 1 pregnant woman expecting identical twins with no moles on their bodies, with different colored diapers to tell them apart." I think you'll agree that this poem is tightly wrought and very beautifully constructed. And I think before we get to the poem itself, let me now very, very quickly trace for you something of the tradition of Indian English poetry, because we should know at what point in the tradition a poet is located. And Ramanujan is a poet basically of the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, and so on. He died in the 1990s after a very illustrious career, of which I'll also speak in a moment. But I want you to take your mind back to the 19th century and to the fact that English had become the medium of instruction in higher education in 1835. The universities, the big universities in our country, were founded soon after the mutiny of 1857, the great Indian rebellion of 1857, Calcutta University, Bombay University, Delhi University, Madras University, and so on. And Indians began to learn the English language with greater zeal because they found that was a passport to jobs in government and service. But it also triggered off a whole lot of creative writing, because when intelligent people learn a language, they also try to dabble in writing in that language. And therefore we had a large number of writers emerging in the 19th century. Even before the universities began in 1857, we've had writers. And I want to mention 2 major writers of the 19th century. One, a woman called Toru Dutt, the other, a man called Henry Desrosiers. Toru Dutt's poetry of that period has within it, and I'm mentioning one poem called The Lotus, which is so beautifully embodying all these concerns of race, color, ethnicity, identity, and so on. But a man like Henry Desrosiers, influenced by the principles of the French Revolution, liberty, equality, fraternity, and so on, tried to transmit some of these ideas to the students in Hindu college. But Hindu college was where Henry Desrosiers was a teacher. And there he produced some very fine verse. Two poems, for example. One is called The Harp of India. The other is called To the Pupils of Hindu College, where he is talking about the need for the young people to open up their minds and to become free and tolerant of other kinds of cultures. And that is true freedom, when you have a true freedom to think. And Desrosiers, of course, was in the forefront of what is called the Young Bengal movement. Another major figure in the Indian English tradition is Sri Aurobindo. Sri Aurobindo also, like Toru Dutt and Henry Desrosiers, had an English education. But then Sri Aurobindo wrote English poetry, and he wrote about English poetry. He used quantitative rhythms, and he used Indian mythology, particularly the Savitri Satyavan story, for one of the great epics in Indian English poetry called Savitri. Now, this is where Indian English poetry begins, and we can think of poetry in English by Indians from around the 1850s, 1860s onwards. But the modernists, amongst whom Ramanujan finds a place, were not very comfortable with Aurobindonian verse, because Aurobindonian verse tended to be grandiloquent, rhetorical, and unspecific. Somehow there seemed to be a kind of mystic, metaphysical dimension. Unless you were initiated into the philosophy, you won't understand what's going on there. And of course, it's true. If you don't know the basic principles of Aurobindonian philosophy, you may find it difficult to understand Savitri, or the deeper meanings. You may understand it in a superficial way. And therefore, in the 1950s, a group of Indian English poets, amongst whom Ramanujan, P. Lal, R. Parthasarathi, and Nissim Ezekiel can be named, they decided that they would move away from Aurobindonian metaphysical verse into a kind of imagistic, modern, ironic, clear-cut, imagistic verse, which would spell a new era in Indian English poetry, which we may call the modern era. I shall now talk about Ramanujan, the poet. We have so far tried to trace a connection between him and the larger tradition of Indian English poetry. And I said that that tradition began in the 19th century, and it continues. Ramanujan, who was actually a student at Mysore University and went on to become one of the leading linguists and anthropological thinkers of the 20th century. He was a professor of linguistics and anthropology in the University of Chicago, which of course is one of the great universities of America. You have Saul Bellow, for example, who was a teacher there. And in fact, Ramanujan and Saul Bellow were very good friends because they were all together in a very well-known committee for social thought. So Ramanujan was interested in not just narrow academics, but also in the larger questions of society, the human concerns of the day, and the burning issues of the time. That is, he's a poet and a literary person, but with a social conscience. Now, Ramanujan was a man of many parts. He was, of course, basically a linguist, and he knew Sanskrit, he knew Tamil, which was his mother tongue, he knew Kannada because he was domiciled in Mysore, he knew Telugu, and he knew a number of other languages. And of course, he knew his English. And then he did some very pioneering work in linguistics. But he was also an anthropologist, interested in language in society, and language as an expression of social culture, of community culture. And therefore, he had a deep interest in what is called folklore. In fact, he produced a very, very well-known collection of Indian folklore, which has become a very important reference book for people interested in this subject. He was a translator, because you can't possibly be a good linguist and not know how to translate. Because one of the fundamental principles of being a linguist is that you go to fields, to different communities and learn their language. Therefore, translation becomes an extremely important aspect of linguistics. You can't be a good linguist without also being a good translator. Okay? So Ramanujan translated. And he translated from the Sanskrit, he translated from the Kannada, he translated from the Tamil, particularly the Tamil. He published 2 books. One is called Hymns for the Drowning, which is the poetry of the 12 Alvars, the 12 Vaishnava poets of Tamil Nadu, the great poetry of the 6th, 7th, 8th century, which he translated into English, and it is considered to be a superb translation. So if you don't know Tamil, you read this and you get an insight into some of the great bhakti poetry of Tamil Nadu. Similarly, he talked about Shiva, speaking of Shiva, which is the vachanas of the Kannada tradition. Many of the poems of the vachanakars of Karnataka, he translated them into English. And he did a lot of work of that kind, apart from translating folk tales and so on. But apart from being a translator, he was also an original writer in English. And that is what concerns us today. Because A River is not a Kannada poem, it's not a Telugu poem, it's an English poem written by a man who knows English. But that is something which I want to touch on a little, the problematic nature of writing in English when you also know your Kannada, when you also know your Tamil, when you also know your Sanskrit and so on. He's going to say something about that. But Ramanujan published quite a bit, but not too much in the way of original English poetry, but whatever he published is really wonderful stuff. Striders, for example, appeared in 1966. Relations appeared in 1971. Selected poems of Ramanujan appeared in 1976. Second Sight, 1986. And collected poems in 1995. So these are the 2 or 3 dimensions of Ramanujan's career. And he died much lamented in the 1990s. He was a visitor to the University of Hyderabad in its folk culture program. And many of us saw him there and interacted with him. He was such a gentle, beautiful soul. I'd like to make one more statement which has a bearing on the idea of translation, that Ramanujan speaks of the outer form of his poetry and the inner form of his poetry. When he talks of the inner form, he's saying that my familiarity with Sanskrit, with Tamil, with Kannada, that constitutes the inner structure of whatever I write. But my professional engagement with linguistics, anthropology, and the English language constitutes the outer form of my poetry. So when I write a poem, I do not know at what point the inner form merges into the outer, and at what point the outer impinges on the inner. So I can only say, says Ramanujan, that in any situation where somebody who comes from India or Africa or some other country and uses the English language, he or she will be necessarily bilingual. There is no way in which you can avoid bilingualism. Even if you don't know 2 languages, the fact that you have a mother tongue is going to have an impact on the way you speak or read or write in the English language. So when you read a Ramanujan poem, and A River, for example, you will need to worry about the manner in which, shall we say, the Tamil tradition of Sangam poetry affects his writing. The rhythms of that poetry, the imagery of that poetry, how does it impinge on his poems? And in Sangam poetry and in classical Tamil poetry, characteristically you will find that they write poetry in such a way that the inner and the outer, the personal and the political, the private and the public, in a way coalesce or merge. One seems to suggest the other. So if you have a very strong feeling of emotion within you, you need to find what T.S. Eliot called an objective correlative to that emotion. This is exactly what happens in classical Tamil poetry. The aham and the puram are 2 aspects of the objective correlative, the subject-object coming together. I shall now try and speak about the poem itself. So I will not read the poem out again, but I shall of course go back to the poem and read portions of it where the illustration requires it. For example, this whole idea of Madurai, we are not talking about Mathura. Mathura is near Brindavan in Uttar Pradesh. Madurai is a major city in Tamil Nadu. So in this poem, he begins by talking about Madurai. And Madurai, as you all know, is a great city of temples, not just the Madurai Meenakshi temple, but many others too. You also have the Alagar temple, a little away from the city. It's also a city well known for the poetic tradition. And the great classical Sangam poets were all located in Madurai city. That is why it is the heart or the seat of Tamil culture. There's usually a kind of conflict between Tanjavur and Madurai on this matter of who has the primacy of culture. And it continues into politics also today. But in Madurai, which is a city of temples and poets, those poets also sang of cities and temples. And as I said, the repetitiveness of the lines, of phrases, of rhythms is a very important part of the poetic construction. And one of the things about Ramanujan is he's got a wonderful ear for poetic sound. And if you listen to the inner rhythms which are visible to you as you read a poem, then you'll find that this poem is really beautifully constructed and it has a wonderful architectonics. That's the term which Matthew Arnold used for great poetry. Okay, so Vaigai is the river in Madurai. If you go to Madurai today, even in this rainy season, you're not likely to find much water in the Vaigai. In the Sangam age, there was so much water in the river that when the rains came, there was a flood. And therefore, flooding, rain, river, these three were major images in Sangam poetry. And Ramanujan, who knows his Sangam literature, is deliberately invoking the Vaigai river in Madurai, which today is in a trickle, but which in the past days was always in flood. Every summer now, this river dries to a trickle in the sand, he says. And then he goes on to give you how this trickling, sparsely watered river also can be seen in terms of some searing images, because he's an imagist poet, right? I told you that modernism implies hard, concrete images. And those images can be seen in this lovely visual impact which you get of a river drying to a trickle in the sand, bearing the sand ribs, straw and women's hair clogging the water gates at the rusty bars under the bridges with patches of repair all over them. This is modern Vaigai or modern Madurai. It is completely unromantic, completely unidealistic. It is the result of depredation, result of modern civilization, if you like, a complete collapse of the old values. All these things have got to be kept in mind when he is making this kind of a statement about what happens to Madurai's great Vaigai river when there is only a trickle now. Even during the rains, it doesn't seem to have much water. Of course, the poet who comes to the Vaigai river manages to see a flood even in the modern period. But I'll come back to that point. So look at the intricacy of the images. Straw and women's hair clogging the water gates. You know, you have these dams and other things under bridges. So those gates have to be opened. But when you have no water, you can see all kinds of little, detritus in there, including straw, women's hair, and so on. Clogging the water gates at the rusty bars. The bars have become rusty over the years because it's not been maintained properly. Under the bridges with patches of repair. Some of them have been repaired a little, so patches can be seen. I think this is an excellent way of conveying the present moment of the past. The present moment of total unromantic, unidealistic culture, a culture which has simply gone to seed. The great Tamil culture is no longer the great Tamil culture of that past, because these people are unable to do anything more. The new poets only quoted the old poets. The old poets spoke only about floods. They sang of floods. Now these people only speak of floods. singing and speaking. There is a contrast going on there. No one spoke in verse now in the modern world. But whenever the new poets quoted the old poets, they completely ignored the fact that the flood took its toll of human life, and particularly of that pregnant woman who probably had twins inside her stomach, twins kicking at the blank walls of her stomach even before birth. The flood washed away that pregnant woman. Now, what I wanted to say is the overwhelming emotions which Ramanujan the poet has, the he in the poem could be Ramanujan the poet or simply a protagonist or a persona. We can't always say that the I in a poem or the he in a poem is the poet. It must be a persona or a mask. But be that as it may, the fact still remains that for this poet, the images provide a kind of an objective correlative for the emotions which he has. So that point which I made about aham and puram are in a way being worked out in this poem as well. Another feature of this poem is the contrast between the past and the present. There is clearly a contrast. The old poets sang, the new poets only write. The old poems talked of the floods, the new poets only quoted the old poets even when there was a flood. They didn't have anything new to say. But both the past and the present, the contrast is not entirely in a kind of binary opposition. On the other hand, Ramanujan is ironically showing that even in the past, when the Tamil poets wrote about the glorious culture of Tamil Nadu, they were not particularly interested in pregnant women who were being washed away by the flood. The human concern, the social conscience was missing even from the poetry of the past. And to that extent, the past and the present are of imagination compact, and they are saying the same thing, doing the same thing. Another point I want to make is that here is a Ramanujan who has stopped living in India. He only visits India, or was visiting India. He's dead now. He lived in America and he's been all over Europe. So he's a kind of, what shall I call him, a diasporic Indian. An Indian who does not live in India but lives abroad but wants to write about India is a diasporic person. And there is a kind of constant yearning for home, constant yearning for roots, and also a sense of the exile and alienation which he or she faces in another culture. Of course, we have now come to a point where many of our diasporic poets are very comfortable wherever they are. Abroad is home. And they are not particularly worried about the fact that they are not living in India or anything like that. So there are levels and stages in diasporic consciousness. But Ramanujan, while writing in the 50s and 60s, did have a lingering nostalgia for Tamil Nadu and for Tamil culture and India and so on. But in this poem, he is equally critical of the present and the past, of India and the diasporic consciousness elsewhere. The fact that he belongs to India and lives abroad does not prevent him from looking at India with a critical gaze and to condemn both the past and the present as he does in this poem. Then I want to speak about the identity questions which this poem throws up. And as I said, because he is a diasporic writer, he is concerned about his identity. Does he belong to a modern Tamil present? Is that Tamil present a good representative of the Tamil past? Does he belong to a culture which is gone, which is no longer there, and he is only imagining a world which existed at one time but which no longer exists? All these questions are hovering around the poem as you read it. And then, of course, there is the human anguish, and the poet is saying again and again that whenever the floods come, women get washed away, pregnant women get washed away, cows get washed away, houses get washed away. The water goes inch by inch up the steps of the ghat, but it is beautiful at one level, but it also has a human cost. So unless poetry and poets also address the human condition, unless they talk about the human anguish and the sorrows of human beings, that poetry ultimately cannot mean much. And that is why he says, he was there for a day, when they had the floods. And he was there is Ramanujan, or a protagonist who stands for Ramanujan, was there in Madurai on the banks of the river Vaigai for a day when the floods had come. People everywhere talked of the inches rising, of the precise number of cobbled steps run over by the water. You know, as you can see, there are steps, bathing ghats and steps, sometimes about 50, 60 steps by the time you come down to the river. And the water, you can know the rising of the water in terms of the number of steps which are submerged in the water. Beautiful, actually, when you see this sort of thing. But somewhere, a woman who was bathing at that point has been washed off. And she had twins, and those twins have not even seen the light of day. They've only seen the stomach lining, the walls of the stomach, and they're kicking at the walls. We don't know what kind of children they might have been. They might have been without any moles on their bodies, he says at the end of the poem. They may have had different colored diapers if they had been born, and yet we can't tell them apart because we don't know what kind of children these were going to be, because they've also died along with the mother. So he said, the river has water enough to be poetic only about once a year. Look at the ironic way in which he says it. And then it carries away in the very first hour 3 village houses. He's very specific, not 4 villages, but 3 villages, because he has said 3 in an earlier stanza. So the repetitiveness of the images, the repetitiveness of the rhythm is very important. The first hour, 3 village houses, a couple of cows, and what are they called? Gopi and Brinda. Typically of Brindavan, one thinks of Krishna and the gopis who are possibly called Gopi and Brinda. Cows there which may have been called Gopi and Brinda. So he is invoking an ancient classical bhakti past also in this poem. And one pregnant woman expecting identical twins with no moles on their bodies, with different colored diapers to tell them apart. I think it's a very touching and a moving poem. And it is a poem which, in my opinion, is very representative of Ramanujan, because all those concerns which I spoke about, identity questions, the contrast between the past and the present, the impact of Sangam poetry and classical Tamil culture on his English verse, the fact that he is unable to distinguish between the inner form and the outer form. The inner form is his Sanskrit Tamil culture, the English is the outer form, and the two merge. Produce for you an extraordinary blend, a tapestry, a palimpsest of poetic excellence.
Even though he is a diasporic writer, most of his writings dealt with the Indianness, typical Indianness. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, that's the whole point, isn't it? That the question of identity which I spoke about in A River is about what constitutes my Indianness, or in Ramanujan's terms, what constitutes my Tamilness. But the fact that he lives outside the country makes him ask these questions. If he had lived in India, perhaps he may not have needed to ask that question at all. R. K. Narayan, for example, I don't think will ever ask himself whether I am an Indian or not. He lived in India, and he simply wrote about Malgudi, which is a wonderful combination of Rayapetta in Madras city and Mysore city, where he lived for a long time. But someone who lives outside the country is more than ever, more than anybody else, compelled to ask these questions about what constitutes Indianness. And this goes along with Ramanujan's essay also, I told you. Is there an Indian way of reading? Of course, Ramanujan is deconstructing this idea of Indianness too, by conflating the past and the present, which I told you, by criticizing both the past and the present, and then looking at the whole thing from a modern perspective. So for him, being a diasporic Indian, of course, creates anxieties of Indianness. At the same time, it does not overwhelm him, because he lives in Chicago, he's quite at home there, and he is able to see India with a critical eye, which distance lends an objectivity to.
Sir, being a diasporic writer, he knows past, but he doesn't know present. It's totally based on imagination, sir, his poetry.
I wouldn't say that, because I think Ramanujan knows the present conditions quite well. But he also has a wonderful sense of the past, and he's able to contrast the past with the present, compare and contrast, to see both difference and similarity. So that makes his poetry very inclusive. Right? Thank you very, very much. It's been a very nice class.